There's an emotion you have felt and never fully admitted to. It arrived quietly, in a moment that should have been entirely neutral. Someone else's promotion, someone else's relationship, someone else's body or house or career trajectory. And for a brief moment, something moved inside you. Not happiness for them whatsoever. Not indifference. Something smaller and sharper. Something you pushed away almost immediately before it could be named out loud. You told yourself it was motivation. You told yourself it was inspiration or just a passing observation. You did everything except call it what it was. Envy is the most privately experienced emotion in the full human repertoire. People confess to anger, grief, loneliness, and even shame far more readily than they will ever admit to envy. Yet research consistently shows it is among the most universally experienced emotions of all. You have felt it. Everyone has felt it. The question most people never stop to ask is what that feeling was actually for. The difference is not who feels it. The difference is what you do with it, and whether you ever understand what it is actually trying to tell you. Psychologists have spent decades carefully separating envy from its closest neighbor, jealousy. The two words are used interchangeably in everyday speech, but they describe completely different psychological events with completely different internal architectures. Jealousy is a three-party emotion. It requires something you already have, a threat to losing it, and a rival who might take it. You are jealous when your partner notices someone else at a party. You are jealous of a colleague who is quietly currying favor with your boss. Jealousy is fundamentally about protection, holding on to what you already have. Envy is a two-party emotion. You do not have the thing. Someone else does. And your response to that gap is envy. The psychologist Richard Smith, who has spent much of his career studying this distinction, describes envy as arising when we see in another person something that we want and do not have, combined with a painful sense of inferiority or injustice around that gap. Two very different experiences can emerge from that collision. The first is benign envy, where the pain motivates you to work harder, to close the gap, to become more. The second is malicious envy, where the pain motivates you to want the other person to lose what they have, rather than to gain what they have yourself. The distinction is not trivial. It is one of the most consequential psychological forks a human being regularly encounters without ever knowing they are standing at one. Here is what makes envy so psychologically rich and so difficult to admit. It is one of the very few emotions that tells you something specifically true, not about the person you are envying, about yourself. When you feel genuine envy, your brain is pointing at something it has identified as mattering deeply, something it has classified as desirable and meaningful and within the general orbit of what you believe you could or should have. Random things do not produce envy. You do not envy a chess grandmaster if you have no relationship with chess. You do not envy a marathon runner if physical performance carries no meaning in your self-concept. The things you envy are a precise map of what you actually want, stripped of all the most socially acceptable filters you instinctively apply when someone directly asks you what your goals are. People often find it far easier to name their surface ambitions in conversation than to sit honestly with what their envy reveals, because their envy is honest in a way they are not always prepared to be. Neuroscience has found that envy activates the anterior cingulate cortex, a brain region strongly associated with both physical and social pain processing. This means envy does not feel abstract or philosophical when it arrives. It registers in the same neural circuitry where the brain processes being excluded from a group, physically hurt, or publicly humiliated. It hurts in the body. This is part of why people work so hard to misidentify it. Calling it something else, calling it dislike of the person, calling it awareness of structural unfairness, calling it mere exhaustion, allows the brain to escape the admission that it is in pain over something someone else has. And admitting that feels, to most people, like weakness, smallness, a failure of character. The philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote that envy was one of the great causes of unhappiness in the modern world. Not because feeling it makes a person bad, but because refusing to examine it makes the emotion stagnant, poisonous, and completely unable to transform into anything useful or forward-moving. What transforms envy from a wound into information is the question you ask it. Research by the psychologist Niels van de Ven at Tilburg University mapped the divergence between benign and malicious envy with remarkable precision across a series of experiments. People experiencing benign envy reported a significantly increased desire to improve their own position, stronger goal-directed behavior, and more focused effort specifically in the domain where the envy originated. People experiencing malicious envy reported increased desire for the other person to fail, diminished personal effort, and a consistent tendency to criticize or devalue the person they envied as a way of closing the gap, psychologically rather than practically. The same painful emotion, the same initial trigger, the same fundamental ache. What divided them was the story each person told about whether the gap between them and the envied person was actually bridgeable. When people believed the gap was achievable, envy pushed them forward. When they believed the gap was permanent or fundamentally unjust, envy slowly curdled into a resentment that had no productive outlet and no place left to go. This is where envy intersects with something far older than modern psychology. Every major wisdom tradition in recorded human history has had something significant to say about this emotion, almost always framed as a warning. But the warning was rarely about the feeling itself. It was about what happens when the feeling is never examined, never admitted, never turned into an honest question about the self and what the self actually wants. The problem with envy that stays permanently unnamed is that it has no exit, no conversion path. It cannot become motivation because it is never acknowledged as envy in the first place. It cannot reveal desire because the desire itself feels too raw and uncomfortable to face directly. It becomes a low-level background noise, a subtle pulling away from people who remind you of where you wanted to go, a slow and nearly invisible dimming of the capacity for genuine admiration. The antidote is not the elimination of envy. That would require eliminating the part of you that wants things, that compares, that keeps an honest internal score. The antidote is the translation of what envy is pointing at. This specific thing in this specific person is showing me something I want to move toward. That translation does not happen automatically. It requires honesty about what you felt in that unguarded moment, and the genuine willingness to let that honesty become direction rather than distress.